The fog had swallowed the county road whole by the time Merrin Ellison came down off the ridge at 4:30 in the morning, and she almost did not see the dog standing in the middle of her lane until her headlights caught two eyes burning back at her out of the grey. She stood on the brake so hard the envelope on the passenger seat slid off into the footwell. The envelope she had spent her whole 12-hour shift working up the nerve to seal, the one with her resignation typed neat inside it and her supervisor's name written on the front. The car shuddered to a stop maybe 15 feet from the animal, and the dog did not run. That was the first strange thing, the thing she would come back to again and again in the weeks after, because a stray caught in headlights bolts every single time, a streak of panic into the ditch, and this one only stood there in the wash of her high beams, grey and gaunt and soaked to the skin, its head low, its legs braced wide as if it had planted itself in the road on purpose and meant to be struck before it meant to move. For a long moment, Merrin just sat there with both hands locked on the wheel and her heart slamming, and the wipers dragging slow arcs across the mist, and every reasonable voice she owned told her the same sensible thing, which was to ease around it and drive on, because she was 27 years old and bone-tired and alone on an empty road an hour before sunrise, and because she had already decided, somewhere back on the ridge with the radio off, that she was done. Done with the night shifts, done with the county and the double loads and the long dark drives home and the feeling, grown heavier every month, that she poured everything she had into the night and none of it ever came back to her. She had a letter in the footwell that said exactly that. All she had to do was get home and put it in the mail. And I want you to hold on to that letter for me, because in about a minute, Merrin Ellison is going to open her car door for a reason she will never once be able to explain to anybody who asks, and the grey dog standing in her headlights is about to hand back to her the single thing she had already given up on, though neither of them knows it yet, and neither of them will understand the whole of what is happening on that road until the sun comes up over a place called Bell Hollow and shows her what has been lying broken at the bottom of it for the better part of 3 days. She tapped the horn, one soft apologetic pulse, the way you would to a person, and not to an animal, and the dog flinched at the sound, but it did not leave. Instead, it did the thing that lifted the hair along her arms. It turned and walked 3 stiff, painful steps toward the shoulder, and then it stopped and looked back at her over its bony shoulder, and it waited. And when she did not move it, walked all the way back into the beam of her headlights and stood square in front of her bumper again. And then it turned and did the whole thing over. 3 steps toward the edge. A look back. A wait. "Come," the look said, as plainly as anything a mouth had ever said to her across a hospital bed. "Come with me. There is not much time." Merrin had grown up on a farm 2 counties over before her grandmother took her in, and she knew dogs, knew the difference between a dog that wants your sandwich and a dog that wants something it cannot say, and everything in the set of this animal's ears and the desperate patience of that backward glance told her this was the second kind. So she did the thing that made no sense at all. She put the car in park in the middle of the empty road, and she left the headlights burning and the hazards ticking, and she pulled her coat around her against the wet cold and stepped out onto the gravel at 4:30 in the morning to follow a soaked stray she had never seen before to the edge of a ravine she had driven past 1,000 times and never once looked down into. The dog led her straight to it. Not toward the ditch, the way she half expected, but past the bent guardrail at the top of the curve, where the county road banked hard above the trees, to a place where the metal rail was scraped down to bright silver in a long, ugly streak, and one post leaned out over nothing. Merrin stopped there with her breath clouding in the fog and looked at that shining gash in the guardrail, days old already, gone unremarked by every other car that had swept around this curve since it was made. and a cold that had nothing to do with the morning went down through her. She took out her phone and turned on the light and aimed the little beam down the slope, down through the wet black tangle of brush and saplings that fell away steep into Bell Hollow toward the creek at the bottom. And at first she saw only leaves and mud and mist. And then, 40 feet down, half swallowed by brush and turned nearly onto its roof against the base of an old oak, the light found a rectangle of dew-beaded metal that did not belong in a forest. A car, a sedan, pale under the mud, nose crumpled into the creek bank, so far down and so wrapped in green that from the road above, in daylight or dark, you would drive past it forever and never know it was there. The dog was already going down, sliding on its haunches through the mud, and it stopped a third of the way and looked back at her, waiting, and Maren went after it. She would not remember the climb down. She would remember only that she went down that slope in her scrubs and her thin coat, grabbing saplings and skinning her palms, half falling the last of it, and that when she reached the car and dropped to her knees in the freezing creek mud and put her light to the driver's window, a face turned toward her out of the dark inside, and the face was alive. He was an old man, old and grey and gone the colour of ash, his cheek pressed to the collapsed roof, one arm hanging at an angle that made her stomach drop, and when the light hit him, his cracked lips moved, but no sound came out, and his eyes, sunk deep and glassy, found hers and simply held on, the way a drowning person holds a rope. Maren had been an emergency nurse for 5 years. She had stood at 100 beds on the worst nights of 100 lives and made her voice do the thing it did now, which was to go calm and low and certain even while the rest of her was screaming. "I'm here," she said through the shattered glass. "I'm a nurse. My name is Maren. I've got you. You're not alone anymore." And the old man, who she would later learn was named Walter, who had been hanging in that wrecked car at the bottom of a ravine for 2 days and the better part of a third night, while cars swept past 40 feet over his head, closed his eyes at the sound of her voice. And 2 tears cut clean lines down through the grime on his face, and he breathed one word she had to lean in through the broken window to hear. "Good," he whispered. "Good dog." She could not open the door. It was crushed and buried against the bank. So she reached in through the broken window and found his throat with 2 fingers and felt for the pulse, and it was there, thready and much too fast. A heart running itself to nothing, trying to keep an old man alive. His skin under her hand was cold as the creek, and that frightened her more than anything else, because she knew what cold like that meant. Knew he was hours at most from the kind of cold you do not come back from. She got her phone up, and it showed 1 bar, 1 trembling bar, and she called it in the way she had been trained to call it in, her voice steady, the county and the road and the mile marker and the curve above Bell Hollow. Motor vehicle accident, 1 patient, elderly male, severe hypothermia, suspected fractures, entrapment, GPs pinned to follow. And she made the dispatcher say it back to her. And then she put the phone on a rock with the light aimed at the sky, and she turned everything she was toward the old man in the car. There is a thing nurses know that most people never have to learn, which is that in the long, empty stretch between a phone call and a siren, you are the only medicine there is. So Maren became the medicine. She could not move him, and she did not try. She peeled off her own coat and worked it in through the window across his chest. And she took the fleece from under her scrubs and wadded it against the side of his neck and his cheek, tucking the cold away from him inch by inch. And she took his good hand in both of hers and held it against her stomach, where it was warm, and would not let it go. She kept the airway tipping his grey head just so. And most of all, because she knew that a mind that gives up dies faster than a body ever does, she kept him talking. "What's your name?" "Walter." "Walter what?" "Walter Brandt. Who's waiting for you at home, Walter?" And the old man's cracked mouth moved, and he said, "Nobody." And then, after a while, he corrected himself, and what he said was, "The dog." The dog. All this while the grey stray had come down the last of the slope and stationed itself at the crushed door, pressed against the metal as close to the old man as the wreck would allow, its ragged sides heaving, and it had not once looked away from him. And when Walter said the dog, the animal made a sound low in its chest, and Maren looked at it, really looked, at the caved-in ribs and the raw-worn pads and the mud caked into grey fur, and she understood, in the way you understand a thing all at once and completely, that this dog had not wandered into her headlights by accident. This dog had been climbing up that ravine to the road. For 2 days and 2 nights it had dragged itself up 40 feet of mud to stand in the path of the cars that never stopped, and gone back down to the man who could not move, and climbed up again and again, throwing the last of itself at an empty road on the chance that one single time, somebody would do what everybody else had not, and slow down, and look, and follow it back into the dark. Everybody had driven past, everybody except a burned-out night nurse with a resignation letter in her footwell, who had every reason in the world to keep driving, and did not. If you have ever been shown loyalty like that by an animal, the kind that has no sense in it, the kind that keeps going long past the point where anything sensible would have quit, then you already know the thing that broke loose in Maren's chest kneeling in that creek, and I would love for you to tell me about it down in the comments before this story goes any further, because the people who find these stories are exactly the people who understand them. Tell me about the dog, or the cat, or the animal that would not give up on somebody. I read every one. The first light was coming grey into the hollow when she heard it, the far high thread of a siren coming down off the ridge, and Maren had never in her life heard a sweeter sound. She shouted up the slope until her throat tore. It took the county crew 20 minutes to reach them, 20 minutes of headlamps swinging down through the brush, and a backboard, and a cervical collar, and a hydraulic tool biting into the crushed door. And the whole time Maren did not let go of Walter Brandt's hand, and the whole time the grey dog stood, pressed to the wreck, and would not be moved, growling low when a stranger came too close to the old man, quieting the instant Maren said its name, except the dog had no name, so she said, "Easy, easy, I've got him, we've got him," and the dog believed her, because it had already decided to. And when at last they had him free and strapped and lifted, when they carried Walter Brandt up out of Bell Hollow on a backboard through the wet green in the first light of morning, the dog climbed up the slope right alongside the stretcher, one worn paw at a time, and it stood at the top by the ambulance doors, and it watched them load him in. And only then, only when the man it had refused to leave for 3 days was finally safe, did the animal's legs go out from under it, and it lay down in the gravel at the edge of the road it had climbed 100 times, and it closed its eyes, and it let go, spent all the way down to nothing, because its work was finally done. Maren rode in that ambulance because they could not have pried her out of it, and when it pulled under the lit canopy of Cedar County Hospital, the same hospital where she had worked 5 years of nights, the same doors she had walked out of 90 minutes earlier, meaning never to walk back through, the whole night staff came running, and there was a strange and wonderful moment where the burned-out nurse who had handed in her notice found herself standing in the middle of her own emergency department with creek mud to her elbows and a stranger's blood on her scrubs, calling out his numbers, his temp, his pulse, his time down, watching her own people close around a man she had pulled out of a ravine, and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not go home. She could not have told you the thought even crossed her mind. She went and washed her hands and put on clean scrubs from her locker, and she went and sat in the surgical waiting room, and she stayed. If you have ever waited on hard plastic chairs for word about someone you had known for only an hour, but somehow could not walk away from, then you understand the next 4 hours. And if you want this channel to keep finding these stories and carrying them to people who need them, take 1 second right now and subscribe, because what happened once they got Walter Brandt warm and stable? The thing he told Merrin 3 days later from his hospital bed is the reason I could not let this story go, and it is the part almost nobody sees coming. They saved him. The core temperature came up, degree by degree, under the warming blankets. They pinned the shattered arm and set the 2 broken ribs and ran fluids into a body wrung dry. And the doctor, an old friend of Merrin's who had worked as many nights as she had, came out at last and sat down beside her and told her the truth, which was that another 2 hours in that cold, maybe less, and there would have been nothing to save. He was severely dehydrated, the doctor said, hypothermic, in the early stages of the kind of shutdown a body does when it has decided the fight is over. And then the doctor looked at her, at the mud still under her fingernails, and he said the thing she would carry the rest of her life. Whatever made you stop on that road, he said, is the only reason that man is alive. And Merrin thought of the letter still lying in the footwell of her car in the parking garage, and she did not say anything at all. Walter Brandt slept for a day and a half, and Maren, who was supposed to be off, who was supposed to be home sleeping, who was supposed to be mailing a letter, came in every one of those hours she should have been resting and sat by his bed, because there was no one else to sit there. That was the part that hollowed her out as the picture filled in from his chart and the sheriff's report and the little the nurses could learn. There was no wife. She had been gone 6 years. There was a grown son somewhere out west, a son named Daniel, but the emergency contact line on Walter Brandt's old file was blank, scratched out, and no one answered the number the sheriff finally dug up. Walter had gone off that road on a Friday night, and it was Monday morning when Maren found him. And in all that time, not one single person in the world had noticed that a 79-year-old man was missing. Nobody had called it in. Nobody had come looking. If not for a stray dog throwing itself at an empty road, Walter Brandt would have died at the bottom of Bell Hollow, and it might have been spring before anyone found the car. He woke on the 3rd day, and Maren was there, and the first thing his cracked lips shaped when his eyes found her face was not a question about where he was or what had happened. It was 2 words. "The dog," he said. And Maren, who had already gone by the county shelter twice on her way in, who had already made 3 phone calls and pulled every string she had, took his good hand and told him the truth, which was that the animal was alive. The county animal officer had scraped it up off the roadside that morning, more dead than living, and it was at the shelter clinic on fluids and a warming pad, and it had a broken toe and a bad infection and a body that had eaten itself down to the bone, but it was going to live. And Walter Brandt, 79 years old, who had hung in a wrecked car for 3 days without a single tear until Maren's flashlight found him, put his good hand over his eyes and wept like his heart had come apart, and threw it in pieces over the next hour. He told her the story of the dog, and it was not the story she thought she was going to hear. The dog was not his. That was the first thing. He had never owned it, never fed it in a bowl on a porch, never once in its life gotten close enough to lay a hand on it. It was a stray, a wild grey thing that had turned up along the county road out past Bell Hollow the winter before, half-starved even then, spooked by everything, running from every car and every voice. And Walter Brandt, who drove that road most nights because he could not sleep in the empty house and the driving was the only thing that quieted him, had started leaving food. Not because he was a soft man, he would tell you he was not. He left it because one January night he had seen the dog standing in a field in the snow, just standing there the way he stood most nights at his own kitchen window, and something in it had looked to him like his own reflection. So he began to leave a bowl of whatever he had at the wide gravel turnout above the hollow, and he would sit in his car a little way off with the engine ticking and watch, and the dog would come only when he was far enough away, and eat like it was ashamed, and vanish. For most of a year they did that, an old man who had lost his wife, and lost his son to distance, and lost the thread of why he was still driving these roads at all, and a wild dog that trusted nothing, keeping company across 40 feet of gravel every night, neither one able to close the gap. He named it, though, he told Merrin, that with his eyes shut, almost too quiet to hear. He had named it, all those months, a name he never said out loud to anyone because there was no one to say it to. He called it Nell, after his wife's mother, a woman who had also taken a long time to trust him and had loved him fierce once she did. Nell. And Nell would never come. And then, on that Friday night, on the same road, at the same curve above the same hollow where he had fed her 100 times, Walter Brandt's tired old heart had stuttered behind the wheel, just for a moment, just long enough, and the car had gone through the guardrail and down. He remembered almost none of the fall. What he remembered was waking upside down in the cold and the dark with his arm on fire and the creek talking somewhere below him, and no strength to move, and no phone he could reach, and the slow, sure knowledge settling over him that this was where it was going to end, alone, at the bottom of a hole, and that no one would even know to look. And then he remembered the sound, a scrabbling in the brush, and a grey face at the broken window. Nell, the dog that had never once let him close, had followed the only kindness anyone had shown her all year, down into that ravine, and she had put herself against the crushed door, and she had stayed. For 3 days she stayed, and she climbed, and she came back, and she lay against the metal at night, pressing what little warmth was in her starved body toward the cold old man inside, and every time he surfaced out of the dark she was there, and every time he was ready to let go, she made him not. She was still fighting for him when a nurse's flashlight came down the slope. The wild thing that would never take his hand had refused to let him die alone, and had thrown the last of her strength at an empty road to save the one man who had ever been gentle to her. He gave her a bowl of food across a gravel lot. She gave him her whole life back. That is the thing I stopped everything to tell you tonight, the arithmetic that undid Maren Ellison sitting by that bed, because she had spent months believing that the kindness she spent in the dark disappeared into it, that none of it ever came back, that a person could pour herself out night after night and be met with nothing. And here in a hospital bed was the plain and stubborn disproof of it. An old man alive because a starving stray had remembered one bowl of food across one hard winter. Kindness returning down a road it had gone out on months before, arriving in the dark exactly when it was needed most. Nothing you give is lost, is what that dog had come to say. It only goes on ahead of you and waits and comes back when you have forgotten you ever spent it. Maren Ellison heard that in a hospital room at the worst and best hour of her life, and she never mailed her letter. But she did make one phone call. She sat in the hall outside Walter Brandt's room with the scratched-out number the sheriff had finally traced, and she called the son out west. The son named Daniel, who had not spoken to his father in 4 years over the kind of small, hard thing that becomes a large one when nobody moves first. And when a wary voice answered, she said, "You don't know me. My name is Maren. I'm a nurse, and your father is alive, and he almost was not. And I think you should hear how. And she told him the road and the ravine and the 3 days and the dog that would not quit, all of it, her voice cracking in the places it kept cracking, and on the other end of the line, 2,000 miles away, a man she had never met went very quiet, and then she heard him begin to cry, and when he could speak he said only, "Is he awake? Can I?" And then, "I'm getting on a plane." Daniel Brandt landed the next evening, and he came down the hospital corridor still in his work clothes, and he stopped in the doorway of his father's room the way people stop when 4 years of not knowing how to start are standing right in front of them, and it was Walter, propped up in the bed with his pinned arm, who broke it, who said his son's name like a question, and then the young man crossed the room and put his face down against his father's shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because they did not need to. And Maren slipped out and closed the door and stood in the hall with her hand over her mouth, and thought about all the closed doors in the world that only need one stranger to knock. The dog came home 3 weeks later. That was its own small war, and Maren fought all of it. Walter would need months of rehab and could not take an animal into recovery, and the county wanted to put the stray up for adoption or worse, and so Maren Ellison, who had come within one envelope of leaving nursing and the county and all of it behind, took the wild grey dog into her own small rented house at the edge of town, the one she had half packed to leave, and she unpacked. It did not go easy. Nell had never lived inside walls, had never been touched by choice, and for the first days she pressed herself into a corner and shook and would not take food from Maren's hand any more than she had ever taken it from Walter's. So Maren did what Walter had done. She set the bowl down and moved away and sat on the floor across the room and waited and read out loud from whatever was near, and waited and did not reach, night after night, until on the 9th evening the starved grey dog crossed the room one trembling step at a time and lay down, not against the wall, but against Maren's leg, and let out a long shuddering breath, and slept. And Maren sat very still on the floor of the house she had almost left, with a wild thing finally asleep against her, and understood that some rescues run in both directions, and that she was not entirely sure any more which one of them had pulled the other out of the dark. They took Nell to see Walter in the rehab wing when she was strong enough, and everyone who has told this part of the story since agrees on what happened, because half the floor stopped to watch it. Maren brought the dog in on a lead, and Walter Brandt was sitting in the chair by the window in the afternoon light, and when he saw the grey dog he did not call to her or reach for her, because he had spent a year learning she could not be reached that way. He only said her name, the name he had given a wild thing across 40 feet of gravel and never once heard answered. "Nell," he said, soft, the way he always had, and the dog's head came up. And she crossed that room, across the polished floor and the whole long year of distance, and she put her grey muzzle into the old man's open hand and pressed her whole starved weight against his knees and stayed there while he bent over her and wept into her fur, and for the first time in her life the wild dog that would never come had come, and she did not pull away, and the name that had never been answered was answered at last. The nurses in the doorway were not any of them dry-eyed, and Maren Ellison, standing at the end of the lead, thought that she had waited her entire career for a single moment that made the whole of it worth the cost, and here at last was 2. Walter Brandt walked out of rehab on a cold, bright morning 11 weeks after Maren found him, with a cane and a slower step, and his son's hand under his good arm, and he moved into a small place near Daniel out west. Close enough now to be looked in on, close enough that no man would ever hang 3 days in a ravine unmissed again. He and Maren talked on the phone every Sunday, an old man and a young woman bound together for good by one night on a road, and he asked after Nell every time, and Merrin would hold the phone down so he could hear the tags jingle. Because Nell stayed with her. That had been decided somewhere in those 9 evenings on the floor, and never once revisited. The wild grey stray that had saved a stranger's life became the settled shape at the foot of a night nurse's bed, glossy now, filled out, the ribs long buried under healthy weight, the flinch gone out of her, riding shotgun on the long drives home from the shifts Merrin no longer dreaded, her head out the window and her ears streaming. And the men on the loading dock and the folks at the diner all came to know them. The nurse and the grey dog. The two of them that had found each other at the bottom of a hole and climbed out together. There is a marker at the curve above Bell Hollow now, a small one, unofficial, a white cross and a flat stone that Daniel set into the gravel of the turnout where his father used to leave a bowl of food for a dog that would not come close. And people who know the story slow down there. Merrin goes out sometimes on a clear evening with Nell in the passenger seat, and she parks at the turnout with the hazards ticking the way they ticked that first morning. And she lets the dog out, and Nell walks to the top of the slope and looks down into the green hollow where she once climbed 40 feet 100 times to save a man, and then she comes back and leans against Merrin's leg, and the two of them stand there in the long gold light, with the traffic sighing past, and Merrin thinks about how close she came to easing around the dog in the road, how close she came to mailing the letter, how 100 cars had swept around that curve and past that shining gash in the guardrail and never once looked down, and how the difference between a man dying alone and a family made whole and a wild thing finally coming home had been one tired person on one dark road deciding to stop. She keeps the letter, by the way. She never mailed it and she never threw it out. It lives in a drawer in the kitchen, folded once, her resignation with her supervisor's name on the front, and every so often, on a hard night, when the old heaviness tries to come back, she takes it out and looks at it. Not to sign it, but to remember how sure she had been, that night on the ridge, that nothing she did mattered and nothing ever came back. And then she looks at the grey dog asleep at her feet, the living proof that she had been wrong about the whole shape of the world, and she puts the letter back in the drawer and she goes to work. So if you take one thing from Merrin and Nell and old Walter Brandt tonight, let it be this: the kindness you spend in the dark, the bowl you leave for something that will not even come close, the small, unwitnessed decency you are sure disappears into the night and never returns to you, is not lost. It goes on ahead of you down the road, and it waits. And one cold morning when you have forgotten you ever spent it, it comes climbing back up out of the hollow to save your life. Merrin was certain hers had vanished. She had a letter that said so. And a dog she had never met, carrying an old man's single winter kindness, met her on a foggy road at 4:30 a.m. and proved her wrong. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the bottom of Bell Hollow and back, because stories like this one only ever reach the people who need them when you carry them a little farther. So before you go, tell me this, and think about it before you answer. When you picture that road, do you see yourself as the nurse who almost drove past and stopped, or as the old man at the bottom waiting for one person out of 100 to finally look down? Because I believe most of us have been both, and I want to know which one you are tonight. Leave it in the comments, tell me about the animal that would not give up on you, and stay close, because next week I have the story of a mail carrier and a cat that sat at the end of the same driveway every afternoon for a reason nobody could explain until the day it snowed. Wherever you are watching from tonight, Let me know, in a word. And somewhere at the edge of a small town, in a house that almost stood empty, a night nurse who nearly walked away sleeps easy at last, and a grey dog that nobody could ever catch lies warm and close at the foot of her bed. Home, both of them, and neither one alone in the dark ever again.